Welcome to the InterTribal Agriculture webinar series. I'm Dan Cornelius with InterTribal Agriculture Council. Today's session is on the USDA Value-Added Producer Grant. We have Tracy Kennedy, Amy Kavanaugh, and Ted Bulow from Rural Development that will be joining us today and presenting. We also have some tribal success stories as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy and Ted.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who might be joining from Alaska or places further west. My name is Ted Bulow, and I am the Native American Coordinator for USDA Rural Development. I'm physically located in Denver, Colorado, but I report up through the national office and have done so for 3 years and 3.5 years from Denver, but I've had this job for coming up on 8.5 years. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be with you today. This is the second year in a row we've done a tribal-specific webinar for our Value-Added Producer Grant Program. A few years ago, we made some clarification through instructions to our field on how tribal applicants could find a pathway to eligibility again for the program. And over the last few years, we have had some success in some folks not only being eligible from Indian country, but actually also receiving grants or awards through the program. So we want to make sure you have a good understanding of the program, good understanding of the eligibility criteria, an understanding of some of the scoring criteria, and we also wanted to start today's call pretty soon into the call with some examples of projects that have recently been funded with tribal applicants both on and off the reservation. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Dan or Tracy. And you can click through the next one, which is our Value-Added Producer Grant Program purpose, which I'll read first, but then I'll add a little context just for your benefit. So the purpose of the program is to provide funds for economic planning activities or eligible working capital expenses to enable viable ag producers to develop businesses that produce and market value-added agricultural products and to create marketing opportunities for such businesses. So the first thing to always keep in mind with the Value-Added Producer Grant Program is that tribes legislatively are not an eligible applicant. The program revolves around agricultural producers, and so part of the explaining we had to do to our staff and to our own decision makers were that tribes can be agricultural producers, and so over the past few years we've tried to take a flexible and open approach to how rural development can fit tribal applicants, whether it's a subdivision of the tribe, a tribe farm and ranch, or other tribal applicants into one of the ag producer buckets which are eligible underneath the program's authority. Next slide, please. Dan, thank you. So there is this authorization. You should know rural development and USDA are no different than any other federal program. We can only do what Congress expressly authorizes us to do, and the term we use is authorization, but it could be considered allowed to do. So all of our program authority goes back to the specific law that Congress passed to allow us to provide this type of assistance and manage this type of program. So if you ever want to do a little reading or fact-checking about our program, you can see where the program was originally authorized on this slide, and the last Farm Bill, which passed in fiscal year 2014, is where the program was last amended. So you can see the actual congressional amendments that were made to the program by looking up that public law, which is listed on the slide. What legislation usually doesn't provide is specific implementation instructions. So that's why USDA and Rural Development and all other federal agencies put program regulations in place, which explain the rules for how a program will operate, the rules for how our staff makes decision, and the rules for how an applicant would participate in the program. And once they get an award, how they would comply with specific program requirements. So that highlighted part in red is the final rule that was just recently published, implementing the changes from the last Farm Bill. So if you're ever having trouble sleeping at night, or better yet, if you're very interested in how the Value-Added Producer Grant works, I would recommend that you take the time, especially if you're going to put together an application, to read the actual founding regulation, because the third layer of instructions comes out in a notice of funding. So if you go to the next slide, please. You'll see that, oh, go back one, please. Thank you. This is this year's funding availability for this particular program. There was a notice put out in the Federal Register back on May 8th that announced this year's funding opportunity. It lists the funding available, $30 million this fiscal year. The application deadlines are both in July. The first is July 2nd of 2015. That's if you're putting in electronic applications through grants.gov. If for whatever reason you run into challenges putting in that application, you have a few extra days to hand deliver a paper copy to one of our local offices. So that's why there's that staggered date. If for some reason you do wait up to the last minute, which we always recommend you don't, but if you have some error in submitting your application through grants.gov, there's that few extra days for paper submissions for you to get those applications over to our nearest office. Maximum award amounts, there's two types of funding available, which Tracy will talk about in more specificity in just a moment. The maximum award amounts this fiscal year are $75,000 for planning and $250,000 for working capital activities under the program. The Value-Added Producer Grant program does have a one-to-one match requirement. That match can be for cash or eligible in-kind contributions, and both the grant and the match funding can only be used for eligible project purposes. So there's specific guidelines that you need to follow on what is an appropriate type of match and how that match funding can be used. The grant period's up to 3 years, 36 months, and that can be dependent on the project's complexity. So with that background of just where we're at currently in this fiscal year, if you could go to the next slide, I'm going to turn the presentation over to a few of our recent tribal funded projects. And if Joni Buckley or the folks from Oneida are on the line, I'd like for them to speak about their Value-Added Producer Grant that they received, how it's going so far, and any advice they would share for future potential applicants in the program. Are you there? Anyone from Oneida?
Are you there?
Yes.
There she is.
Oneida Tribe is still here.
Well, while we're waiting for Joni, do we have Paul Evans on the line? Okay, well, I'm going to jump in while we're figuring out the audio issues with them. This is Dan Cornelius with InterTribal Agriculture Council, and I'll give a little bit of a background on one of the applications that we had worked on last year. There was a group of individuals in the Great Lakes region that started meeting to form an InterTribal Maple Syrup Producers Cooperative a couple of years ago, and you know, as the efforts started coming together, we were looking for some funding to help to really refine the overall business plan and operational model of what we were looking to do. And so the Value-Added Producer Grant was an opportunity that really stuck out. And we worked on an application over the period of a couple of months. And one of the great things with this grant, it is a larger application to do, but at the same time, doing the application helps to, it requires you to really refine what you're trying to accomplish with your overall business, business objectives, and the feasibility study as well. You need to put enough thought and to put those thoughts down onto paper as part of the application. So the application itself was a great opportunity to help to start refining that. And now that we were awarded this grant, we're using it to help to fund a feasibility study, and using then those results to from the feasibility study to put together a business plan. One thing that I did want to talk about, though, and one of the challenges that will be talked about later on, is that there is a match requirement on there's a match requirement on this grant. In our region in the Great Lakes, one of the tribes, Shakopee, had put up matching funds a couple of years ago that can be up to 25% of the total project, or half of the match. And so that's available for tribes in the Great Lakes as well as the Great Plains. We do still have some of those funds available, and it's something that I would encourage in other parts of the country, or if there are tribes or sources of funding that are willing to contribute. It's a great way to help to reduce that barrier and to provide some cash match that can help not only with the scoring criteria, but can help with the overall project's operational capacity. So that's a little bit of a background for the InterTribal Maple Syrup Producers Cooperative, and we're working on trying to get Joni on the line. Joni, are you there yet?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, good. Hi, and thank you for inviting us. This is Joni Buckley with the Oneida Tribe. And we applied, and we're so appreciative, first of all, of Dan finding the match funds, because we didn't have the match funds. But we applied for the grant to really assess our white heirloom corn. And the application was for $80,000 on it. The scope of work that we had, the first one was to create a feasibility study on a new product, and the other one was to look at testing it in the outside market, outside of the reservation, and especially in Indian country. So for us, it was very valuable because we would never have had the resources to allocate to testing the product. And in the end, we ended up with a new product, a pancake mix. So we had a community rollout to get the feedback on the taste and texture of it, and the veterans put it on. So overall, it was exceptional for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Joni. Do we have Paul on the line from Ute Mountain?
Marcy is here, but Paul could not be here this afternoon. I'm very sorry to say.
Well, it's okay, Marcy. Did you want to give a little bit of a background on the Ute Mountain project?
Well, you know what? Joni actually was involved in this in the beginning, and we appreciate that very much, Joni, and we appreciate everything that USDA has done to help us get our project off the ground. It helped us. It gave us funds that allowed us to do some marketing research and help develop our bags for our cornmeal project. And it helped us get off the ground. It was a very big deal for us to have those funds to help us get our project off the ground. And now we have an actual mill, and we're getting started. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Marcy. This is Ted Bulow again from USDA. I think now we'll turn over to Tracy Kennedy. Marcy, unless you want to add something else about Ute Mountain.
If anybody has. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer. But since with Paul not being here, I don't know what more what more information you'd like to hear from us.
Well, if I think it would help for folks just to. I've had the good pleasure and the good fortune of visiting your community a couple times, but folks probably don't know about the extensive nature of your ranch. So if you want to talk about the corn that you do produce and your irrigation or anything that you think might be helpful about your production. that would be good. But if you're not prepared to do that, that's fine as well.
Well, I'm not really prepared to do that. We're a 7,700-acre irrigated farm, and we do grow our own non-GMO corn for the corn mill to make the corn meal products. And we also raise alfalfa and a little bit of wheat. But alfalfa is our major crop, and now the corn certainly is a major crop for our corn mill. So we grow yellow, white, Indian, and blue corn that we're milling into cornmeal. And that's our new venture. It's called Bow and Arrow Brand, the new venture.
Perfect. Thank you very much. With that, I want to introduce Tracy Kennedy, who helps run and administer our Value-Added Producer Grant program back in Washington, D.C. I don't know if Amy wanted to share any information, Tracy, but I'll hand it over to you for the time being.
Okay, thank you, Ted. Amy, if you're on the line, if you'd like to jump in and make any comments, please do. As I'm going to go over a few things with you today briefly. We did have some changes to the program regulation in 2015, and I want to briefly touch on that, and then we'll head into just a basic overview of the program requirements and follow that up with pointing you to some tools and resources to use, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So as Ted mentioned, we have had some changes in 2015. There was a regulation change, and that usually results from some sort of statutory change, often from the Farm Bill, that we need to incorporate in our regulation. And that did happen with 2014 Farm Bill. There were the addition of veteran farmers and ranchers to a priority category, as well as the creation of a new priority category for group applicants, and I'll go over that in a few minutes. At the same time, the agency is obligated to respond to public comments on the Farm Bill provisions and on the previous version of the regulation, and if there's any reason to make changes in response to those comments, this is also the time that we do that, and we did have that that experience this time. And finally, the agency will use that opportunity during a revision or a rewrite of the regulation to make any clarifications or other revisions to conform to other program definitions, to include information that we hadn't included previously, or maybe just to make some sort of procedural or administrative cleanups. So we did do those things, and most of the changes, aside from the Farm Bill changes that were required, were changes to the definitions. And I'm only going to cover one significant change that directly affects tribal applicants, but I do encourage you to take a look at the VAPG website and click on the link for the program regulation. And what you'll find there near the top of the document, in the starting part of the document, is called the preamble, and it'll give you a list of all the changes that were made and the rationale for making those. So you may want to go back and take a look at those briefly and see if there's anything else there that might affect your application or your applicant. And the actual regulation itself starts there about halfway down the document. As Ted mentioned, the tribal eligibility for the value-added program has been a little bit of a challenge for the agency, since tribes were not specifically eligible, but it was a priority for us to find a way for tribes to be eligible. And initially, the response that we came up with had to do with some definitional interpretations. Those of you who have followed the program, know that exclusion really had to do in the beginning with the inability of tribes to meet the definition of independent producer, which is a key component of applicant eligibility. And the definition requires that applicants be made up exclusively of ag producers. And because of the way tribes are structured, and tribal agricultural interests and entities are essentially owned, as it were, by the tribe as a whole, and not all tribal members engage in ag production, then this was a big hurdle. And this is a little bit complicated to go through, but I wanted everybody to understand the change that I'm getting ready to talk about. Now, we did find a way in 2010 or 11, I guess, to make that work, and that was by utilizing the definition of ag producer, which, as of 2009, was allowed to include not only people participating in the day-to-day ag operations, but also those with financial ownership and control of the enterprise. And that was interpreted to mean that tribal members were, in effect, ag producers by virtue of their collective ownership and control. And that's what we've been using to qualify the APG applicants from tribes and tribal entities. However, this year, in responding to some public comments prior to the publication of the latest version of the rule, there were some objections to allowing what were termed passive investors, meaning those who weren't directly engaged in ag production, to be applicants for a program that was intended for farmers and ranchers. This had nothing to do with Native American participation. It was just a concern about non-ag producers being the beneficiaries of the program. And as a result, the agency revised the definition of ag producer to look like this. This is the first part of the new definition of ag producer, which is an individual or entity that produces an agricultural commodity through participation in day-to-day labor management and field operations, or that has the legal right to harvest an ag commodity that's subject to the value-added project. So what that means now is that individuals or entities that have financial ownership and control without being engaged in that day-to-day activity are no longer eligible for the grant. And that was, again, a bit of a hurdle for us because that was what we hung our hat on to qualify tribes for the program. So here's what we came up with. This is part 2 of the ag producer definition. And that is that the agency shall determine agricultural producer status of tribes and tribal entities without regard to day-to-day labor management and field operations and the right to harvest status. So there we are. And what does that mean? What does that mean for you going forward and for our offices out there determining eligibility for tribes and tribal entities? What are we looking for, and how are you going to prepare for that? And essentially, it's much like the process that we asked you to go through last year. If you were interested in the program last year, we have an appendix in the application toolkit that offers guidance to tribes. And in preparation, what we want you to do is to just make sure you can answer these questions that are in the template that regard the composition, structure, and relationship of the applicant entity to the tribe, and who benefits from the returns generated by the project, because you must meet all of the eligibility standards, not only applicant eligibility standards, but all the eligibility standards. And if you're able to address these questions, that will help you and the folks in the state offices that might be helping you out come to a determination about whether you are in fact eligible for the project or for the program. I'm going to go into that. I'm going to give you a little bit more information on that in just a second, but I'm going to go through some basic program requirements. And this is an overview, and I really need to emphasize that you must become familiar with the program requirements in detail, as it's found in the program regulation, in the Notice of Funding Availability, the NOFA that was published in the Federal Register, in the application toolkits. It's essential that you familiarize yourself with that material. So the basic program requirements are applicant eligibility, project eligibility, purpose eligibility, and then the evaluation criteria. We have 4 eligible applicant types. We have independent producers, which, as I just mentioned, are sole proprietorships or entities that are made up completely of agricultural producers. We have agricultural producer groups, which are nonprofit membership organizations that represent or advocate on behalf of agricultural producers. And this year there was a slight change in that definition to include the nonprofit part because that was not something that was readily understood. It has always been the intent. And examples of those kinds of groups would be, for example, state or national farmer or commodity associations. We also have farmer or rancher cooperatives and majority-controlled producer-based businesses, which are entities that are made up of a majority of farmers or ranchers, but may have passive investors or others who are not active farmers as minority shareholders. All of the applicant types have to currently be producing and must own during the project, produce and own 50% or more of the raw commodity that will be used for the value-added product. And all of them must own the product from its raw commodity state through the value-added process. There is an exception if you are applying in a priority category for a mid-tier value chain project, then the ownership does not have to remain with the applicant throughout that process. There's also an emerging market requirement in applicant eligibility for agricultural producer groups, the cooperatives, and the majority-controlled businesses that have to demonstrate that they're entering an emerging market as a result of the project, meaning that they cannot have supplied the proposed product or geographic or demographic market for more than 2 years at the time of application. Independent producer applicants are excluded from this requirement of emerging market, meaning that they can apply for expansion projects for a currently produced and marketed product. So the key questions on applicant eligibility for the tribes are going to be, is the tribe or tribal entity the applicant? This could become an issue if, for example, you have a non-tribal partner in a particular enterprise especially, but this is something that would be key for you to answer. Does the tribe or tribal entity produce and own more than 50% of the raw commodity? Do they own the product from the raw commodity state through the value-added process? And will the tribal members and or tribe as a whole benefit from increased returns resulting from the project? So keep those questions in mind when you're trying to determine if you're eligible for the program. Moving on to project eligibility, the components of that are the value-added product methodology, expansion of customer base, and revenues returned to the producer. And there are 5 value-added methodologies that you need to qualify under at least one of those. First is change in physical state, which is just what it sounds like. It's essentially a process that converts the raw commodity into something else in an irreversible way. The second is produced in a manner that enhances the value of the commodity. And this one's a little bit confusing. This has to do with the set of agricultural practices used to actually produce the raw commodity. And in a way that enhances the value over that a more standard or conventional production practice would do. And the most obvious one that we use as an example is organic production over conventional production. There are some other things that could come in under that, but it's essentially how it's produced that actually enhances the value of the product. Physical segregation means that the value of the commodity is enhanced by keeping it separated from the time it's in the field through the time it's processed or sold. And an example of that would be non-GMO corn from GMO corn. Farm to ranch renewable energy means that the farm or ranch in question is a source of a commodity that's used to generate energy on the farm. This is usually, since it's farm-based, going to be an anaerobic digester or maybe a small-scale biodiesel project.
Unless they have somebody standing there and pull it that way.
And geothermal projects are not eligible for the program. In terms of producing fuel stocks for larger off-farm energy projects, those would typically come in under change in physical state.
We have 2 ladders.
And
Hey,
finally,
Tracy, could you hold on for just a second?
Agricultural food products. And this means that the product is marketed and sold within 400 miles or within the same state in which it was produced. And note that this is a food product. This is only for products that are meant for human consumption. All applicants for project eligibility have to demonstrate that they increase the customer base, their current customer base. You would be expected to provide a baseline of what your current customers are, either for the raw commodity or for the value-added product. And they will also need to demonstrate that the revenue derived from the value-added process, that the greater portion of that revenue does return and benefit the producer of the raw commodity.
Can I get the down here?
In terms of purpose eligibility, we have the types of grants, use of funds, budget and work plan, and matching funds. And we'll go through those quickly. As Ted mentioned, there are 2 types of value-added grants. The planning grant is used to pay for the development of feasibility, marketing, or business plans related to the processing and or marketing of a value-added product. And the working capital grant is used to pay eligible project expenses related to the processing or marketing of value-added product. You can apply for a planning grant followed by, in a future round, by a working capital grant. You cannot apply for both at the same time.
Yeah.
There are a couple of, well, there are 3 variations on working capital grants that you should be aware of. Requests of controlled applicants do require a feasibility study, and that should say, and a business plan. Those are required documents, so those have to be included with the application. For requests of $50,000, independent producers proposing market expansion of existing products, only a business plan is required. And for all applicants, requests of less than $50,000 don't require either a plan or a feasibility study. So keep those in mind. In terms of use of funds, it'd be really helpful if you went back to the regulation and there's a more comprehensive list of examples of eligible costs there, and neither that nor this one are all inclusive, but it would be helpful for you to go back and make sure you're familiar with the kinds of costs that are eligible. But typically what we see are processing costs for the product, which might include the labor, utilities, packaging and labeling, additional ingredients that would be required. You can also use grant funds to purchase additional raw commodity from third parties. Remember that applicants must produce and own at least more than 50% of the raw commodity needed. So if you require more than that amount, up to 49% of the total amount required can be purchased using grant funds. You can use grant funds for advertising and promotion. You can use it to purchase financial and accounting systems, including some computer hardware. There's quite a bit of flexibility in terms of what you can do with eligible costs, but there's also some pretty hard rules about what you cannot include or pay for with grant funds. And those include the purchase of land, buildings, or equipment, preparation of the grant application, research and development, including architectural and Oops. Architectural or design work. I'm not sure why that keeps flashing back like that. Okay, it needs to stay on examples of ineligible costs. All right, there we go. So architectural or engineering design work is also not an eligible cost, and expenses for the actual production of the raw commodity, including harvesting or delivery to a processing plant, is not allowed. Basically, what we're talking about are expenses related to processing and marketing. So what we're looking for is expenses up to or at the door of the processing plant forward. That's a good way to think about it. Anything that's happening in the field or on the way from the field to the place where it's going to be processed or packaged is not an eligible expense. And again, please go back to the regulation and take a look at the more comprehensive list of eligible and ineligible costs. The program does require a work plan and budget, and note that the work plan is a component for eligibility, and it's also a scoring component. So you only have to note it. You have to note it once in your application. You can include it as a part of the scoring criteria or as a part of the eligibility, and just reference back to it for the other part. But it is both an eligibility and a scoring requirement. The detailed work plan and budget needs to show how the goals are going to be accomplished, and it must include a description of the eligible activities and associated tasks. We want a budget breakdown of the estimated costs allocated to all of those activities and tasks. You'll need to identify the key personnel who will be overseeing and conducting the project, a specific time frame for completion of all of those tasks, identification of the sources and uses of your grant and matching funds for all of those tasks, and you need to designate a grant period that meets the start and end date requirements of the program. And finally, on purpose eligibility, we have matching funds. As Ted mentioned, there's a one-to-one match required. That can be in the form of applicant provided cash, loan, or line of credit, or applicant or family member in-kind contributions of their time spent working on the project. But that is limited to 25% of your total project costs. So 25% of everything you spend can be fairly valued time spent on the project by the applicant or family member. Matching funds can also include cash from a third party or third-party in-kind contributions. And note that matching funds have to be spent on eligible expenses only, with the exception of that 25% in-kind from the family. That is an exception to the grant and matching funds requirement. And again, this is covered in much more detail in the regulation and also in the application toolkit. And if you have any questions about these kinds of things, please don't hesitate to contact your state rule development office, or if you have additional questions, you can contact us at the national office as well. There are some other eligibility requirements that I'm not going to go into in detail, but you just to be aware, multiple grant eligibility means that you can't, one entity can't submit multiple grants in response to a single solicitation or for a single year. It also means that if you have had a working capital grant for a project, you can't submit a second working capital grant for that same project. Active grant means that if you got a grant last year, it has to be closed out prior to the application deadline of the current year. And grant period is, as Ted mentioned, up to 36 months, depending on how complex your project proposal is. It's not an open 36-month period. We expect your work plan and budget to include a time frame during which you'll shoot to get those activities done. There is a possibility in extenuating circumstances for a single 1-year extension on that grant period, but it is up to 36 months. And finally, completeness. One of the things that is common among all applicants is they might get caught up in one part of the application or another, whether it's applicant eligibility or addressing the evaluation criteria, and then kind of lose some steam and maybe not address all of the requirements completely. You must include all of the information necessary at the time of application, because once that deadline passes, we cannot accept additional information for your application. So make sure that you have everything required, all of the forms, all of the requirements are addressed before you send that in. Or if you have time before the grant period has been reached and you discover that you've left something out, you can send that in. But once the application deadline has passed, we will not accept that information. Next are the next important components are the evaluation criteria. These are the performance evaluation criteria and the proposal criteria. Performance evaluation criteria are the things that the agency uses to help measure whether or not you're meeting the goals of your project and whether the project is meeting the goals of the agency. And so we have some requirements. This is very important. If this is not included, your application will be determined ineligible. So make sure you address these requirements in your application. First of all, we're going to ask each applicant to suggest one or more criteria to be used to evaluate whether or not their goals or objectives are being met. The goals will be stated in your application. So what is it that you want us to look at to determine whether or not those goals and objectives are being met? Also, applicants must estimate how many jobs are expected to be created or saved as a result of the project. And for working capital applicants, we want you also to include and to at least reference the information that you have already included on expansion of customer base and increase in revenue from the applicant eligibility section. That's a very important piece of information for us to have. So again, please make sure you take time to address these criteria. And finally, we have the proposal evaluation criteria, and this is what the reviewers are going to score your application on. So you've done all the eligibility requirements. Hopefully you've been deemed eligible, and when we get that determination back and you are an eligible applicant, then what we'll do is send this out and you'll get 3 sets of scores. Your state office will provide a set of scores, and then there will be each application will receive a set of scores from 2 different independent producers. So you'll receive 3 sets of scores. The proposal evaluation criteria are, oops, how my animation for a second. Nature of the proposed project, which has a number of components, and you want to go to the NOFA that was published in the Federal Register to get the specific requirements for that, all of the components in that, but it's going to be things like you're going to tell what you're going to do, the value-added process that you're going to use, what the expected outcome is, whether you think it's technically feasible, operationally efficient, and those kinds of things. So you want to make sure that you address all of the elements there in that criteria, and that's worth up to 30 points. So that's a big one. We're going to look at qualifications of the project personnel. That includes both those you may have hired to do some of the work, whether it's a consultant or someone that you're hiring to do marketing or any of the tasks that you're proposing in your work plan, we want to see what their qualifications are. We'll also want to see the qualifications of the people supervising the project, and that's usually the applicant. And that's 20 points. Commitments and support is going to be looking at whether you are the sole producer providing raw commodity to the product. The more producers that you have involved in the project, the better you should score on this. We'll be looking at whether you have end-user commitments or support, which would be in the form of letters of interest or intent to purchase your value-added product, and also third-party commitment, which is parties that are providing tangible support to your project, whether it's someone you're contracting with, a consultant, or so forth. And you want to make sure that you have all of the documentation from that's required when you look at that with those components. The work plan and budget, again, as I mentioned, that's both an eligibility and a scoring criteria, so that's worth up to 20 points. So some attention to detail is required there. And finally is priority points, which is if you qualify in a priority category, this is where that comes in. In prior years, there was 0 or 10 priority points. It was all or nothing if you qualified for one of the priority categories. Because of the new additions that we have this year, it's now 5 points for one part and up to 5 additional for the other part. And so let's take a look at that. So the first part is that if you qualify as a beginning farmer or rancher, a veteran farmer or rancher, socially disadvantaged, small or medium-sized family farm, farmer or rancher cooperative, or if you're proposing a mid-tier value chain, you could be eligible for 5 additional points to be added to your score. And that's simply for qualifying in one of these categories. There is information in the application template about the documentation requirements necessary for these categories. And the second part of that is new. This is the group applicant priority category that I mentioned earlier. And this is up to 5 additional points to ag producer groups, cooperatives, or majority-controlled businesses that propose projects that will best contribute to new or expanded marketing opportunities for beginning farmers, veterans, socially disadvantaged farmers or ranchers, and small or medium-sized family farms. There's information on that in the template and in the regulation about how we're going to work with that, but essentially, if your organization or group qualifies as one of these applicant types and has any of these priority categories as members already, or if you can show how you're going to add additional members who fall into these categories already, then you could qualify for up to 5 additional points under the priority category. So please take a look at that if you think you might be eligible for that. Talk to your state office. Let us know if you have additional questions. And those.
Hey Tracy, I'm sorry. If folks are on, if your line isn't muted, could you make sure to mute the line? Sorry, go ahead, Tracy.
The program is very competitive, and the priority points can be critical in awarding the funding. Sometimes it comes down to fractions of a point, literally, and so if you see that you might be eligible for any of these scoring priorities, and you have questions about that, please let us know. Okay, so those are the basic requirements, and again, you need to check for the detail in the regulation and the NOFA. And once again, out there, if you've not muted your phone, if you're in the background,
need to mute their phone.
Chatter back there. So your phone is open, someone. So I want to go through and I want to point you to some tools for applicants. The first one is to go to our webpage at USDA, and we have a brand new webpage for value-added producer grants. And that will contain a lot of information for you. The basic information and some links are contained on this page here. And then there's a tab here that will have links to forms and other resources. So I encourage you to visit that. And what the other things that you might find there are, we do have some outreach sheets, fact sheets available. We've got one on general program information, locally produced food, harvesters, and mid-tier value chains, and we are busy adding some additional ones. So those might be handy for you just as a refresher or as a quick fact check on what those particular components of the program look like. We also have the comprehensive toolkits for both planning and working capital grants. We separated those out last year and found that that worked well because the requirements for planning and working capital do differ slightly. So make sure you take a look at that. And those toolkits will contain a checklist so that you can go through and make sure you have all of the components necessary for a complete application. It'll have the links to all of the forms necessary. It also has links to the program regulation and the NOFA. And it'll also have links to the DUNS number site and the SAM site. And the DUNS number is the required registration number that anyone doing business with the federal government must have. And you need to do this, get this first. And you go to this site, it's free. Please do not respond to anyone who wants you to pay for a DUNS number. It is a free service. Next, you'll want to go for the System for Award Management site, where you'll register and you'll get a code, and that will give you a registration. It'll give you a code and an expiration date, and that registration must remain current throughout the life of the grant. But you'll want to do this one, and please don't wait until the last minute to do that because it can take time, and the SAM system is also notorious for getting bogged down. So please make sure that you do this at the beginning. We also have the toolkits contain individual optional templates for planning and working capital applications. These are optional. They're highly recommended because it includes everything that you need for your application. It'll include all of the elements that you need to include and guide you through that. It doesn't have to be on this this template, but all of the information that the template asks for does have to be in your application. And finally, the appendices contain guidance for tribal applicants for the required documentation showing good standing of the business and so forth, everything else. There's a place to put all of the documentation that's asked for in the application. It has templates for verification of matching funds, and it also has the information and guidance to walk you through how to determine if you're eligible for priority points or reserve funds. Now, this year there are not going to be any reserve funds, so you just want to pay attention to the priority point eligibility forms back there. If you need assistance, we suggest that you go first directly to your state offices. You'll find a list of contacts here at this link, and you can also feel free to contact us at national office if necessary. And if you have some specific questions about tribal questions, you might also check in with Ted. He's a great resource, and he can answer questions on specific tribal issues that we may not be able to, and we'd have to go back to him anyway. So if you want to check in with him, that would be great as well. And I think that's it for me, but we'd certainly be happy to field any questions that you might have.
Hi, this is John Hendricks with Choctaw Fresh Produce.
Yes.
Can you hear me okay? We have an organic farm, so I guess could you clarify, I know that in terms of grant funding for personnel, you said it doesn't count for work in the field, it counts where they begin processing?
Yes.
So do you have any more detail on where that break line is for organic farming?
Well, it would include, I'm sorry?
I would just say, is it after harvest? Or?
Yes, it would be after harvest.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
We did have some additional questions that were asked in the chat box. A couple of them have been answered, but whether seafood is eligible was one of the questions that had come up multiple times.
Seafood? Yes.
Yes.
There's a couple of ways that seafood can be eligible. If you are a commercial fisherman and you're fishing open waters, fields, or streams, or rivers, or ocean, you could be a harvester. If you're licensed to fish, that could be an option. Or if you are in aquaculture and you're actually cultivating seafood or fish or shellfish or mussels or whatever in a particular place, then you could qualify as a farm or ranch. We did have a change in the regulation this year in the definition of agricultural food product, which affects whether you want to come in under locally produced. So let's say if you are a cultivator of oysters and they are oysters that are, that you want to market to restaurants and you want to sell them live, of course, to restaurants for oysters on the half shell or whatever, then that would be included. The previous definition for agricultural food product excluded live animals. And so we were getting inquiries from people who were growing shellfish and crustaceans that are traditionally sold or consumed live. And so we went back and made that change to allow those to come in under the locally produced category. But you can certainly come in, as a commercial fisherman or as an aquaculture operator there.
Another question is, could the development or addition of an aquaponics or hydroponics process to an agricultural system be eligible?
The actual feasibility of the production process would not be part of it. I know it's difficult to separate those two out, but it really needs to be focused on whether you're going to have a marketable product and what that looks like. We don't really fund feasibility or planning for the production side of it.
I would just like to add on to that answer. I would refer people to the Rural Business Development Grant. Unfortunately, the applications for the tribal set-aside on that recently closed, but take a look at that one for the future, and your states may still be accepting applications for their allocation. That's the Rural Business Development Grant.
Dan, can you hear me? This is Ted.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was just going to add that even though the tribal application, the tribal set-aside deadline has passed, tribes do quite well in the regular program, and that's why there are the staggered dates, so tribal applications can compete in both. So don't rule it out, and there's always next year. So thanks for bringing that up.
Another question that was asked and answered was about whether this could apply for legal fees, for planning grants, or to determine the best type of entity organization, and the answer that was provided by rural development staff on that was no.
Yeah, there could be at some point you know, typically if you're in the, you have to be an entity at the time of application. So if you come in as a steering committee, even if you're on the planning side, you still have to be, and so those costs would have already been incurred. So that's the answer to that question in a little bit more detail. Yeah, I mean, that's legal fees in terms of, you know, organization type. So.
Another question on the text that was asked is regarding the eligibility of energy crops, such as switchgrass.
I'm sorry, such as what?
Switchgrass.
Oh yes. Yeah, that could come in if you know, depending on what they're doing with it, if they're converting it in some sort of feedstock, biofuel feedstock, that would come in under change in physical state. If it's something that they're doing, you know, it's on farm. In order to be in the renewable energy category, it has to be on farm generated, and the source of the energy has to come from on the farm. So, you know, we're looking at manure for anaerobic digesters and so forth. But there are definitely possibilities under the change in physical state category.
Do we have any additional questions?
I'd like to just, this is Leah here from IAC, and I'd just like to clarify on the process of application as a steering committee. Is it right that you can apply as a steering committee, but that you need to be formed as an organization before the award is given out?
Yes, that's correct.
There may be some costs.
I'm sorry?
There may be some costs for creating bylaws and such for a cooperative, but those wouldn't be eligible expenses for the grant.
Right, those costs would not be eligible because they would be incurred prior to the grant period starting.
Got it.
That is Bruce Savage. I had a question. Would custom finishing the wild rice as opposed to conventional practice be considered an added value product?
I'm not sure I can answer that question off the top of my head, but if you want to send some more details, I'd be happy to get back to you. I suspect. Well, I think I really need more information. I don't want to say anything right, you know, and get it wrong the first time. But if you could send me some more information about the process, I'd be happy to get back to you on that.
Okay, I guess I can contact your email address.
Absolutely.
Hey Dan, it's Ted. Dorothy Shockley had a question about whether or not a boat for, I think it was for oystermen. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I believe the answer for that type of equipment and any type of equipment in that matter is no. Correct, Tracy? Yeah,
that's
oyster
correct.
farmer who needs a boat.
Equipment or vehicles of any kind.
So would that also extend to packaging equipment? Would that be eligible?
In general, yes. I mean, there's some exceptions as to what is considered equipment by federal regulations. And the short answer is that equipment is anything with a value of $5,000 or more and a useful life of 1 year or more. So that's sort of the short answer to that. There's some other things that, you know, could fall through the cracks, but if it's large packaging equipment, that's not gonna work. So there is a change in the federal regulations regarding eligible costs, and there is a little bit more clarification on those kinds of expenses. But in general, the answer would be no, that those aren't acceptable expenses. Anyone else?
The question just came in, is equipment considered an eligible match?
Okay, well, I think we just answered that. In general, no, as long if it's meets the definition of what the government considers equipment, which again is a value of $5,000.
Could you use it?
Useful life.
Could you use it for matching funds though?
No, the grant and matching funds have to be used for eligible purposes. Both of them.
And we've got one more question coming in here on the chat.
Those wires are poking up though. Do we want to duct tape them down there on that door frame on this side? What is it? I need a little added.
So another question that came in, would maple sap be allowed, would be considered an eligible match instead of maple syrup?
Well, I'm not quite sure what that means. Typically, we allow the value of the raw commodity to be used as match. So if that's what they mean, that's the sap that's they're going to be using to make the maple syrup, then yes, the value of the sap. So.
Yeah, and looking at the question from Bruce, I'm not sure if that's a match question or an eligible activity question. So Bruce, I don't know if you can clarify.
Maple syrup is an eligible activity, so as long as you have the access and rights to the harvest of the sap.
Match or eligibility?
Eligibility.
He was asking that in terms of eligibility.
Yeah, I mean it is an eligible activity. Maple syrup is, as long as you're harvesting the sap.
And to clarify, maple sugar would be the same as maple syrup. It would just be further refined, and I think that'd be the same for maple candy. It would be just a further refinement of the same commodity.
Sure. Anyone else?
I think that seems like that is about all the questions that we have. I want to thank rural development staff for joining us today, and also remind everyone that the recording of this session will be available on the Indian Ag YouTube channel, and also check the IndianAgLink.com. That's the main IAC website, where we do have the PowerPoint slides for this presentation are posted on there, and we'll make sure that the link to the webinar is posted on there as well. So again, thank you very much to the rural development staff and for everyone who took the time to join us today. And please get in touch with your local office if you have specific questions, or get in touch with your local technical assistance specialist with IAC, and you should be able to find them on IndianAgLink.com. Thank you very much, everyone. That concludes today's webinar.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
We appreciate the opportunity.